Hi, folks, and welcome back to The Original Church. Did the original Christians kneel in liturgy? Did they kneel for the Eucharist? Did they receive the Eucharist on their knees? That's what we're going to talk about today. Now, I'm sure you know that at the very beginning, liturgy was very informal. It was in people's homes, and it was as a part of a meal. And, there are people who want to go all the way back to that. But as you know from the book of Acts, there is the danger of falling out the window. So there's that. But presumably, people received the Eucharistic elements at the very beginning at the table, during a part of a meal, and in a Roman context, possibly even reclining at the table the way ancient Romans ate. Pretty soon, however, the sacrament of the Eucharist becomes a separate morning liturgy, and still mostly in homes, though, until the 4th century. And also, they did have Mass out in the cemeteries and in the catacombs. The point of all this is that in the original church, people stood to pray, and that counts for the Eucharistic prayers too. Kneeling was seen as a posture of penance. And so in the original church, the early Christians did not kneel to receive the Eucharist. They prayed facing east toward the rising sun because of the resurrection. Not because Jerusalem is to the east, because if you're east of Jerusalem, then Jerusalem would be to the west. So it's not like the way Muslims pray facing Mecca, for example. And it's also not because of the play on words of the Son of God and the sun in the sky. That homonym, that pun, son, that only works in English. So it has nothing to do with that, really. But the point is that the resurrection of Jesus took place at dawn. So when you pray, you face east because you're facing toward the dawn in recognition of the hope of the final resurrection at the second coming of Jesus. And so they prayed standing in the orans position, which is just Latin for the praying position, head raised, hands lifted. That's how people prayed. Sometimes people actually put their arms straight out to stand in a cruciform position while they prayed, like Jesus on the cross. But for the most part, people prayed standing with their heads raised and their hands lifted. And that is how they stood for the liturgy. The only time people knelt during the Mass was when they were doing penance, which was effectively kind of like a temporary excommunication. If you went to confession, especially if you were confessing mortal sin, the bishop might say, for a certain amount of time, you will not be receiving the Eucharist. And so for that time, or for part of that time, you might have a penance of kneeling while the other people stood for the Eucharist. So actually, in the original church, the only people kneeling during Mass were the people not getting the Eucharist that day. In fact, in some times and places, there were rules against kneeling. You could not kneel on Easter Sunday. Clement of Alexandria said you cannot kneel at Easter or at Pentecost. And this seems to be the consensus of the church fathers in the 2nd century, because you hear that other places as well. And some went so far as to say you could not kneel on Sundays at all. And now there are variations on this theme, but you get the idea. And now, of course, it would be seen as appropriate to kneel on Good Friday, and then maybe developing into kneeling during Lent. And over time, eventually, it all got put together into kind of one thing, combining both standing and kneeling. But the sitting part, that's really just a mercy. No one sat down but the clergy in the original church, and they did not have pews. So all of this, the way we have historically knelt during the Mass, is a development. It's not a bad thing. It's a good development. And you can see how, in most cultures, kneeling is a posture of humility and submission, which is entirely appropriate for worship. And so there's nothing wrong with what developed into the later pattern of kneeling during parts of the Mass. But this is not even universal across the church. In my experience, in other cultures, in other countries, the kneeling and standing is actually done differently. And so here's the point. If anyone tells you that you must receive the Eucharist kneeling, There is no evidence of that in the original church. In fact, in the early church, kneeling was for when you were not receiving the Eucharist. So don't worry about those people who say it's wrong to receive the Eucharist standing or in your hand. And on that, see my other video on receiving in the hand. In the original church, guess how everyone received the Eucharist? Standing and in the hand. And that's how it was in the original church. See you next time. Hey, thanks for watching. Well, you know the drill. Subscribe, notifications, blah, blah, blah. But if you liked this video, please share it. And if you want more, consider getting one or more of my books. Or better yet, join me and the original church community on locals.com. There you can comment and interact with the rest of us. I hope to see you there.